It's a pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight for the seminar on cultural history at the Bard Graduate Center, and also welcome to those of you watching on BGC TV. Our speaker tonight is William Stenhouse, who is currently the chair of the history department at Yeshiva University. He has his first degree from Balliol College, Oxford, second degree from the Warburg Institute, and his PhD from the University College London. He's the author of probably the most important recent book on inscriptions in the 16th century, and certainly the most important recent book on inscriptions in the 16th century in English, Reading Inscriptions and Writing Ancient History, Historical Scholarship in the Late Renaissance, published in 2005. And before that, while still amidst the toils of doing his PhD, he was the editor of the volume on inscriptions in the Harvey Miller multiple volume edition of the Paper Museum of Cassiano del Pozzo. Over the last 5 or 6 years, he has been producing a series of articles that, as a whole, really amount to this generation's revision of Roberto Weiss's classic book on the discovery of the past in Renaissance Italy, really the first attempt to synthesize a generation or more's work on antiquarianism and the study of the material remains of ancient Rome. So to give you a sense of the kinds of questions Will has been interested in, I'll read you the titles of some of these articles. Visitors' Display and Reception in the Antiquity Collections of Late Renaissance Rome, published in the Renaissance Quarterly in 2005. Antiquarians and the Preservation of Antiquity Collections, published in a volume, Dynastic Collections, 2009. Epigraphy and Technology, The Impact of the Printing Press, published in 2010 in a volume entitled Latin on Stone. Visualizing the Roman Triumph, Descriptio and the Antiquarian Imagination, published in the Papers of the British School at Rome in 2012. The Renaissance Foundations of Modern Antiquarianism, published in Alain Schnapp's volume World Antiquarianism, I guess just about out now from the Getty publications, and Monumental Letters in the Late Renaissance in a volume on communicating observations in early modern letters. And I should say that his talk tonight on conservation and the study of ancient objects in the 15th and 16th centuries in Italy comes as the conclusion to this little mini-series we have been indulging in over the past 24 hours in this room on conservation and the history of conservation. So today's talk will, I think, provide a kind of deep background to the question of how and for how long, and in some sense why, it has been important to conserve or preserve or restore ancient objects. It's with great pleasure that I turn the microphone over to Will Stenhouse.
Thank you very much. On the 13th of October, 1480, representatives of the Comune of Brescia announced that, and this is the Latin here, we have decided unanimously that the finished stones which were recently discovered in the ground and removed to the site of our Comune should be preserved. So that's conservare, and we'll come back to this, but I'll translate it as preserved for the public buildings of our community, and that they cannot by any means be given away, sold, or removed, and that no proposal can be made to give away, sell, or remove any of the said stones unless the person wishing to make a proposal of this sort should make for each stone a deposit of 2 ducats to go to the Comune, whether the proposal is accepted or rejected. These finished stones, the lapides laborati, were sculpted Roman remains found during the restoration of the city fortifications. Usually, such finds were simply reincorporated in the walls or ground down for lime. In this case, though, the Comune decided to try to keep them for, as they say, public buildings, and not simply for the foundations of those buildings. A few years earlier, the council had decided that one wall of their main square was to include finished stones, and the finds from the city walls fitted that bill. Between 1484 and 1489, they were fitted into the walls of the new Piazza della Loggia, where they remain today. So this is the piazza, and they are you can't really see them in this thing, but there are inscriptions in these walls still. This is the kind of the modern publication of them, and so these little numbers show where the ancient inscriptions appear there in Brescia. At Brescia, then, we see evidence of a very deliberate attempt by the town to maintain and display the remains of its past. The decision's not unknown, but I think that it's played a less central role in accounts of the history of collecting than it should have done. The role of civic authorities in the creation of a collection is important, I think, as is the form that the collection eventually took, a wall, but one in the middle of town. And it's not an isolated example. I've found various other 15th and 16th century parallels from both the Italian peninsula and France. I was looking at these displays in the spring when Peter invited me to speak, and it struck me, as well as demonstrating a civic commitment to collecting, that they're also a good Renaissance example of a culture of conservation, or at least of preservation, as a kind of precursor of conservation. And I was hoping to tie this into last night's discussion, and I'm not sure I can, but we'll see. Humanists responded to the physical remains of the Roman past in a variety of ways. But one of the most fundamental was to try to protect and keep what they found. They often failed, particularly in expanding cities. You see the tradition of laments over Rome, or more generally the notion of devouring time, as Peter mentioned last night. But these small collections offer useful case studies of how and where they might have succeeded. So first, I'll review some of similar attempts to create collections. I'm going to focus on inscribed monuments, which, as you gathered from Peter's introduction, I'm most comfortable with. But they're also the kind of easiest way to do this because they're best documented and they've been edited, so they're easiest to trace. Often the collecting towns were small, away from large centres, and they collected on a pretty limited scale. First one of these, in Osimo, so this is northeast Italy. By the late 15th century, some inhabitants had placed 13 Roman honorific bases, statues with bases, in the city's central piazza. At least 9 further examples were then added in the 16th century, and in the early 17th century, the city entrusted a man called Ercole Gallo to arrange them in the entrance of the new Palazzo Comunale, which is this, and so they're still there now. In Viterbo, Annius of Viterbo explicitly invited his hometown to preserve the antiquities that were discovered in 1492 or 1493, arguing that without civic protection, the finds would be destroyed. 5 sarcophagi from the Cipollara, which is close to Viterbo, were placed in the Palazzo di Priori in 1494, along with this one inscription on the left-hand side here, so-called decree of Desiderius. Now, as people know, Annius of Viterbo forged a lot of stuff, including this inscription. But from my point of view, what's important is that he wanted it preserved by the civic bodies rather than it was, in fact, it was made up. The town officials did not display all the material Annio found, however, and in the course of the 16th century, the sarcophagi seem to have disappeared. It was only in the 1580s that the priori displayed the relief and 3 other forged inscriptions, which had been found in the 1490s. Along with the decree. And so the one on the right-hand side here is one of those other ones that had been found and then put in storage somewhere and was redisplayed in the 1580s. At Reggio Emilia in 1493, prominent representatives of the city proposed to Ercole d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, that some recently discovered Roman sarcophagi should be displayed in what they called some public place so that they can be seen by all. But here nothing happened. In Pesaro in 1523, representatives of the town placed a newly discovered bilingual Etruscan Latin inscription in the Palazzo dei Priori, and then in the 1560s and 1570s, contemporary records suggest that some inscriptions discovered in the town during building work were taken to the palazzo directly, others brought in from the countryside, and one family, the De Gozzi, bequeathed examples from their collection to the city in 1575, and these were all recorded together in situ by contemporary epigraphic scholars. And at Palermo in 1586, the Senate gathered 24 inscribed stones from across the city and brought them to the civic Palazzo Pretoriano. They installed them on the southern wall with a modern plaque which recorded that the praetor and other officers of the town were responsible for their installation. The phenomenon was not limited to the Italian peninsula. At Lectoure in southwestern France, not far from Toulouse, a series of inscribed altars was discovered during the restoration of the cathedral choir in 1540. These were then placed on the porch of the Maison Commune. Jacques-Auguste Dutout saw them in 1582 and assumed that they were being stored there as raw material for the rebuilding of the cathedral, which had been damaged in the wars of religion. But at some point, the civic authorities must have made the decision to preserve and display the stones as stones. In 1591, when they rebuilt the town hall, and that's what you see here, they placed two inside in the walls of the main room and used the remainder as supports for the columns around the building. Okay, and so this is, you'll have to kind of trust me on this, but those things are these altars. In Bordeaux, the Jura of the city used the Hôtel de Ville, which already had one inscription in its walls, to house a city collection. In 1590, they took one monument which had been preserved in the Royal Chateau Trompette, and when in 1594 coins, fragments of mosaic, and 3 honorific statues were discovered, they claimed those too, installing the statues in the central courtyard of their building. So that's a modern plan. These are what they had, the statues that they used, and this is what they looked like in the early 17th century. So we can point to a few examples where civic governments have tried to preserve and display several antiquities publicly, in most cases with some success. I'm excluding here the display of iconic individual examples. And so again, among inscriptions, the Ugivine tables, which were bought by the Comune of Gubbio in 1456 and preserved in the palazzo there, where they're still today, or this large bronze inscription from Lyon, which was found in 1528, and a local antiquarian brought it to the kind of notice of the civic government. They bought it and housed it in the Maison Commune, and it's still in Lyon. And as well as inscriptions, there are kind of other examples of this, individual statues which have kind of been displayed, claimed and displayed by civic governments as well. It's probably a little anachronistic to limit the cases to recognizable civic governments and to talk about them as the only guarantors of public access. In the Kingdom of Naples, for example, local associations of noblemen and commoners, often with judicial and fiscal responsibilities, met in buildings called seggi. We can identify several cases where these seggi included antiquities, as Fulvio Lenzo has shown, and he's part of a wider project looking at the fate of antiquities in Campania and southern Italy. For example, some seggi included inscribed pieces at their corners. Others had ancient statues by the entrance and inside. In Capua, this trend was particularly striking, and it's notable that the city governmental eletti seem to have seen the seggi as suitable repositories for antiquities and worthy of public support. So the eletti voted money to these seggi to house these things. They did this in 1513, and this should probably be connected with a decision they made in 1514 to protect the amphitheatre at Capua as part of kind of the same kind of move towards conservation, or at least preservation. Already at this point, the seggio of noblemen included inscriptions in the base of the arch at its entrance. Okay, so this is, it's kind of been very much reworked, but originally this structure was the arch at the entrance of the seggi, and what's behind is later, but you can kind of see the inscriptions here at the bottom corners. Inside, the walls had more inscriptions and portraits, busts. Later in the 16th century, the Eletti decreed that various inscriptions should be gathered and placed in what they called the logo principalissimo of the town. And this seems to have been adjacent to another seggio of Sant'Eligio. And I think, I'm not quite sure, but I think this is, they're talking about this building here, but kind of adjacent to the church, and this is the Palace of Justice. So this is from an 18th century engraving. And you can see that they were kind of using the Palace of Justice for classicizing statues as well there. So in this case, in Capua, I think you could say the civic body was working with these kind of quasi-private organizations to preserve these antiquities. Nearby in Avella, there are different issues. There, a man called Ottavio Cataneo organized for several inscriptions to be displayed in the central square of the town in 1592. And this, I'm afraid, is the best photo I've got of this, but we're talking about these things here. Cataneo was a Genoese who had bought the fief of Avella. And because the inscriptions were placed outside his dwelling, this is where he was, they should be kind of initially regarded as baronial possessions, but they were displayed to the public and remained there after he died. So it seems that they would kind of then form the basis of some sort of civic collection. So those are the collections. How can, in what sort of context can we put them? So one certainly is to see them as a continuation of long-standing traditions of medieval spoliation and display. Roman finished stones, to use the language of the Brescia decree, had regularly been used to make walls from the 3rd century onwards. And so when in the 15th or 16th centuries, early medieval walls were breached, taken down or restored, antiquities regularly came to light. Medieval walls at Brescia were the source of the inscriptions that the Comune displayed, facing outwards in the new piazza buildings. The 3rd century walls at Bordeaux provided nearly all the inscribed material for that city, including the inscriptions that Vinet encouraged the Jura to place in the new Civic collection. Perhaps humanists in Brescia and Bordeaux even understood that their honorific inscriptions were likely to have originated in the city's central areas, and so they were kind of returning them to their proper places. An alternative is display of inscriptions in the walls of Narbonne, created at the bidding of King François Ier, very much royal rather than civic command, but a good example of the conscious display of antiquities as building materials and objects to be viewed. So these are walls from the early 16th century that then included antiquities above the gates. Francois proposed that the antiquities discovered should be put up there, and he kind of ordered that they should be fairly high up and protected therefore. And most of this does not survive today, but we've got a pretty good idea from early photos and engravings. Particularly in central and southern Italy, spoli were used in civic and domestic architecture, particularly in the late medieval period and into the Renaissance, and this is well known. So Rome, famous examples from Rome, the 11th century Casa dei Crescenzi, where, including ancient material and a modern inscription, or 12th century inscription, attesting to the civic commitment of its owner and his desire to renew the ancient splendor of Rome, through to the 15th century, Lorenzo Manlio's house, now in the ghetto. You can go and live there, I assume. A modern inscription, kind of again attesting his kind of classicizing interest, alongside ancient bas-reliefs. Or even jumping ahead to the early 17th century, Francesco Gualdi's antiquarian ironic response to the tradition. He put material he'd found on the outside of this medieval tower where he was living at that point, kind of advertising his museum. There are many other examples in Sicily and southern Italy. Again, as everyone knows, I think, well, most people know, in some cases, these things seem to have been included without a huge amount of thought. This is from near Perugia. Others with more kind of deliberate kind of interest in display and presentation. Venosa here is one of the most famous. Spoli were used in the walls of church and in private houses. There are spolia in Palermo, for example, and in many buildings in Capua. So when the senators of Palermo gathered inscriptions so that they said they would be visible forever, or when the Eletti of Capua decreed in the late 16th century that certain inscriptions were to be placed in the center of town, they were protecting them from potential builders as well as celebrating their predecessors. And when Cataneo in Avella placed inscriptions in front of his baronial residence, the appearance of the palace, I don't think, would have appeared unusual. And churches and other ecclesiastical buildings had long been places where visitors could see pagan remains on display. The sites and uses of spolia varied on walls, in floors, as capitals for columns. In Brescia, citizens could have seen various examples, fragments inside and outside on the walls of churches. And in one case, here, a Roman altar used to hold up the central vault of the crypt in the church of Santa Maria in Salario from the second half of the 12th century. Here, you can more or less see it here. The Roman altar has an inscription which is Deo Soli, which originally would have been a dedication to the god of the sun, but I assume that it was interpreted as to God alone, and that's kind of why, in this case, it was restored there. This practice continued in the 15th and 16th centuries. Some examples I don't think were readily accessible. So, for example, this is the chapel built by Pontano in Naples. It's his kind of like mausoleum based on an ancient model that he used. And some of these inscriptions are ancient, and some of them are modern. And he seems to have kind of thought it his job to do both and preserve the ancient ones alongside his new funerary monument. Other examples, much more easily visible. So, for example, in Rome, this is the eagle, ancient eagle that Giuliano della Rovere preserved in the porch of the Santi Apostoli in Rome from around 1480. Also, I think, connected with that is this pagan altar that he reinscribed and placed inside. As you can see, he's dedicated to the Eucharist, but then he tells you why it's there. So, when the communal authorities of Brescia decided to preserve the rediscovered antiquities in the late 15th century, the format they chose in wall would not have surprised the town's inhabitants. In general, we can say that the ways in which most towns displayed their new collections as part of walls in town squares by buildings accessible to the public owed much to medieval arrangements. They support the theses of Salvatore Settis, who has aimed to place Renaissance antiquity collections within traditions of reuse in a progression from spolia to collected object to museum piece, rather than seeing them as new creations inspired by humanist rediscovery of the past. And he's been interested in their wider cultural and political contexts. Under the influence of Settis' work, for example, scholars have pointed out that many of the early private collectors of the Renaissance used forms of spoliate construction to display their pieces. So Bianca de Vitis has shown that in Naples, Diomede Carafa made antiquities an integral part of his palazzo, over the front gate here, around its inner walls, and inside the courtyard here. What are new to the Renaissance are the increasingly deliberate and pointed references to the past, although even here there are some important pre-15th century precursors. Humanist scholars and their patrons were eager to preserve, gather, and study relics of the classical past. They thought that the physical remains provided unmediated access to antiquity, unlike manuscripts of texts that had been clouded and corrupted by medieval ecclesiastical scribes. They also pointed out their relevance to the present. In Rome, as Kathleen Christian has argued, several families immured antiquities in places that were easily visible, near the entrances or the reception areas of their palaces. Often these pieces connected the families concerned with Roman Republican predecessors, predating both Roman popes and Roman emperors, and so suggesting these families' independence from papal or imperial authority. Outside his house, for example, Santa Croce here displayed a relief of the Roman fasces, okay? A symbol of his authority and of the state's magistrates. We can see humanist parallels to these Roman developments in civic collections. Brescia, for example, was a center of the new scholarship. The city supported a number of active humanists and housed important printing shops, whose output was marked by a strong preference for classical texts. Its Roman origins had attracted antiquarian scholars, including Feliciano from Verona and Marcanova from Venice. Its citizens were therefore conscious of the value of the relics of antiquity. In 1486, Michele Ferrarini came from Reggio Emilia, which was to be the site of the failed attempt to create a collection in 1493, to supervise the printing of his edition of Valerius Probus's Guide to the Interpretation of Abbreviations in Roman Inscriptions. And during that time, he scoured the Brescian countryside for examples of ancient inscribed stones, and these are some examples of his work. He put them together in what the historian Capriolo described as an antiquarium, presumably a collection of information about antiquity for civic officials. And here's another example from Brescia of the one on the left is an inscription in the wall that I showed you earlier, and on the right, humanists has come to study it. This is a bit later in the 16th century, but it seems as though the town is kind of drawing people in. In Bordeaux, it's fairly clear that one local humanist, Vinet, Elie Vinet, was an important influence on the city's authorities, who commissioned the collection. Among them was another classical scholar, Gabriel de Loeb, who was the town syndic and wrote a brief account of the antiquities that the city collected, which had been found in 1594. Their written accounts of the city's history and antiquities make clear their commitment to classical learning and its protection. But this commitment was rarely disinterested. In the case of these municipal collections, they made very clear that both the existence of Roman remains and the preservation of them contributed to the status and prestige of the various towns. A tradition from Arezzo held that a Florentine general deliberately buried various Roman remains in the foundations of the new fortress in the city, a fortress that Florence was building to preserve its dominion. The marbles with ancient inscriptions of the Romans are manifest signs of the Aretines' high dominion and their antiquity, this historian wrote. They were placed in the foundations in contempt of their worth as antiquities and against the wishes of the citizens. And so cities who made collections wanted to do the opposite of the Florentine oppressors. Often, the terms in which this local pride was stated were relatively straightforward. In the case of the failed proposal to collect tombs at Reggio Emilia, for example, the decree's authors wrote that they wanted to add luster to the city and to make it famous. In Palermo, the senators wrote that displaying the discoveries contributed to the eternal glory of the patria. Shortly afterwards in Bordeaux, the Jura erected a plaque making a very similar claim, that their actions contributed to the everlasting glory of Bordeaux, just as the Capua and Aleti protected their amphitheatre in the name of the public and universal good and honour, stating that no one could take the stones from that monument, which represented the antiquity and fame of the city of Capua. These civic statements stress the difference between the sites where the remains were to be found and the purity of their new surroundings. In Palermo, the senators wrote that the remains they displayed had been buried or covered in filth. In Bordeaux, one inscription had been, according to the modern kind of plaque, covered in dirt and dust. Beside one inscription in Capua, the Aleti pointed out that for the glory of the patria, again, they had spent 40 ducats in displaying ancient remains. Remains also could demonstrate the care of new governments. In Verona in 1486, a single classical description was displayed with the following addition: what carelessness lost, carefulness restored to antiquity. Civic governments were embellishing and sanitizing their cities as they honored their pasts, for which their displays offered clear proof. Individual antiquities presented the opportunity to make particular political arguments about the status of particular towns under Rome. So back to Brescia again. The prominence of the inscription mentioning Julius Caesar, and so this is kind of a big one here that appeared there just to the left of the main arch, that appears still there. The prominence of this reminded humanists of Caesar's grant of Roman citizenship to the area in 49 BC. In an encomium of the city, Giovanni Stefano Buzzano, one of these humanists, referred to the dignity and honor that the inscription conveyed. The bronze inscription on display in Lyon recorded a speech made by the Roman Emperor Claudius, in which he recommended that members of the local aristocracy be allowed to enter the Roman Senate. It thus demonstrated the distinction of the city in antiquity. One of the inscriptions in Bordeaux mentioned the abbreviation bit viv. All right, so it's a very unusual abbreviation in Roman inscriptions. And Vinet, the humanist, interpreted this as Bituriges vivisci. Okay, this was a Celtic tribe mentioned frequently in ancient authors, and a target of Julius Caesar in the Republican period. Okay, so you know, Julius Caesar said he defeated this lot. Okay, but the fact that they're dedicating this altar to a Roman emperor, so the Augusto here, suggests that something at least lived on long after Caesar's death. And it confirmed the idea that they had a degree of freedom and autonomy even under Roman dominion. Okay, so these start to become kind of means of making historical arguments. Objects of this sort, which highlighted past privileges, could therefore contribute to contemporary status. Similar claims could be made from the volume of material presented. In his early 16th century history of Brescia, Capriolo stated that the city could be seen as the sister of Rome. So many ancient remains were to be found there. In another era, perhaps, this would have been a challenge to the pedigree of Venice, which at that point was Brescia's colonial master. But in the late 15th century, the wall of inscriptions created made sure to acknowledge Brescia's subservience to Venice. That's that again. Okay, so back to Brescia again. These two here were modern inscriptions, kind of rooting the whole kind of ensemble. One of these was in honor of Marc Antonio Morosini, who was the Venetian-appointed podesta of the city when the display was put up. The other recalled the loyalty of the Brescians and compared it with that of the ancient Saguntines, whose commitment to Rome had become proverbial. No religious monuments were included in this display, and relatively few funerary dedications. So, in terms of the classification of Roman inscriptions, most are tombs of some sort or another, or dedications to the gods. These are all kind of in honor of famous men of various sorts. So, the inscriptions were disproportionately skewed towards dedications and records of public honors, presenting a series of great men from antiquity. It's probable that Ferrarini, or someone who shared his interests in the 1480s, made the selection for the Comune as an appropriate display of public achievement and honor under Rome, and perhaps therefore the same local tradition could be adapted for proud service to Quattrocento Venice. So, we can see these collections as the latest stage in traditions of spoliate construction and as manifestations of humanist historical pride. They were also clearly determined efforts towards the preservation of the past. There is late medieval evidence that some towns tried to restrict the export of classical masonry. Modena, for example, forbade the export of lapides magni, presumably large ancient stones, in 1327. The best evidence for the continuation of this trend in the 15th and 16th centuries comes from Rome, unsurprisingly. Popes, humanists, and civic authorities played out a complicated series of maneuvers over the question of the preservation of the city's buildings, symbols of grandeur, but also useful stores of building material, and of the export of individual antiquities, which were prized by collectors in the city and beyond. David Carman has argued from the legislation that was passed in the late 15th and 16th centuries that the popes were more committed to the preservation of buildings, at least, than has usually been acknowledged. In the course of the 1520s, he says, we can see that papal legislation became considerably more specific in its efforts to preserve ancient remains, and we can identify a new interest in locating the source of value for the city precisely in the age and antiquity of Rome's historic artifacts. I'm not quite convinced, if only because the regular issuing of more and more specific rulings suggests that previous examples were being ignored, and parallels with the export of antiquities suggests that theory and practice regularly diverged. And so we have plenty of kind of restrictions on the export of antiquities and then plenty of licenses kind of issued immediately afterwards. What Carman does show, I think, though, is the development of a vocabulary of preservation. In the middle of the 15th century, Flavio Biondo saw the return of the papacy as necessary and useful for the preservation, and the term he uses here is conservatio, of the city. In practice, Biondo was more interested in restoration. Okay, so his famous kind of account of Rome is the Roma instaurata, kind of Rome restored, rather than kind of Rome preserved. But his successors in the 16th century, I think, although I haven't, kind of tried to document this in any real way, I think they're happier to kind of talk about preservation than Biondo was. Certainly, papal and Capitoline directives often back this up, using the term conservatio. I don't think that we can really pin down what they meant by this, because their use and application were not consistent. And a complication here, I think, perhaps, is that civic magistrates in Rome were the conservators. But I've argued that we should assume some sort of creative interpretation. When Cardinal Andrea della Valle planned the Hanging Garden in the early 16th century, he built new niches to house statues on ancient bases. So there's on the left and right here. But he also immured reliefs and employed antique columns to hold up the attic story. Okay, so this is kind of up here. The papal Camerlengo Agostino Spinola referred to Della Valle's project as follows: restoring statues and other stones to their former appearance, imitating buildings collapsed through time, and refreshing those buildings for their new use and enjoyment. The pieces that Della Valle used came from the ruined Arcus Novus on the Via Lata in Rome, damaged during renovations to the church next door at the end of the 15th century. And if he used these and kind of restored them in this way, I wonder if Della Valle's creation could not be seen simply as a new building, but as a sympathetic reference to the old one. I'm not quite sure what to make of the verb refresh that this papal official uses. It's reparando in Latin. But I think that's the implication. Outside Rome, governments of small towns had little chance of preserving high-value antiquities against the wishes of predatory princes or even determined local aristocrats. The Brescia decree, as we saw right at the beginning, explicitly allowed applications for the stones in return for a non-returnable deposit of 2 ducats. For example, in Pesaro, which kind of was creating a kind of collection in the 1520s, the fragments of this bronze statue were found in 1530 and went straight to Francesco Maria della Rovere and not to the Comune. Although the author of a preface to the city statutes could still kind of talk about these as proof of the city's distinction. Local governments had more chance with quotidian inscriptions and fragmentary statues. In one case, the Civic collection preserved the memory of oppression. The headless statues in Osimo came to be that way, according to local tradition, because the Milanese Gian Giacomo Trivulzio decapitated them after capturing the city in 1487. The Osimo collection that remained in the aftermath of their defeat can be interpreted as a demonstration of the city's persistence then, and even now for makers of expensive organic pasta. Civic or institutional connections also offered a means for collectors posthumously to protect what they'd collected from unscrupulous heirs. Paula Findlin has shown that one of the main anxieties of the Renaissance collector was his heir. How could he prevent his dissolute son from dispersing the collection out of disinterest or poverty? Collectors experimented with wills designed to keep their objects together, but the fate of the famous Bembo collection, which was not protected by such means, worried other collectors. So Aldrovandi, for example, left his collection to the Senate of Bologna. Perhaps in Pesaro, the De Gozzi family saw the civic body as a means to ensure that at least some of their local antiquities remained within the city, which explains their donations in the 1570s. In Catania, in the early 17th century, a local aristocrat dedicated several inscriptions for display in the Palazzo Comunale, apparently thinking along the same lines. How, finally, should we put these collections into the history of collecting? First, I think it should make us think again about the agents involved in assembling antiquities. Traditionally, collecting of antiquities in particular in this period has been seen as the domain of either private individuals or of rulers and their families, with 2 exceptions, the Capitoline collection in Rome and the Venetian Statuario Pubblico. From the perspective of the history of museums, Sixtus IV's donation of various statues to the people in Rome in December 1471 has been seen as a landmark moment, giving impetus to the first civic museum. As a historian of later artistic institution puts it, Sixtus's act would merit being the first entry in a universal inventory of museums. Because he restored the statues to the Roman people from whom they originated, he laid the foundations of the idea of a museum as a guardian of a municipal or national identity that was therefore public and perpetual. Okay, and I think this is anachronistic, certainly in its terminology, but you can kind of see what he means. Scholars of 15th century Rome now argue that Sixtus was less an enlightened public servant, sensitive to Rome's past, and more a politically savvy leader, distancing himself from his predatory and acquisitive predecessor, Paul II. Paul II had exhibited the wrong sort of collecting, hoarding precious objects without public benefit. Sixtus, on the other hand, made a public gift, presenting the civic government with a significant responsibility, even if it was largely ceremonial. Certainly, he inspired local Roman aristocrats to consider doing the same. Both Gabriele de Rossi and Marcantonio Altieri tried to require their heirs to keep their collections together, and if those heirs did not do so, the antiquities were to go to the Capitoline, away from the antiquities market and out of the hands, more particularly, of the Pope. These efforts failed. In Venice, Domenico Grimani left his antiquities to the Republic, which stored them in a room in the Doge's palace. When his nephew Giovanni Grimani wanted to add his much larger collection to his uncle's pieces, he specified that they should be put in a public place, so that, quote, foreigners who have seen the Arsenale and other marvelous sights of the city should also see these antiquities. Giovanni died in 1593, and the collection was opened to the public in 1596. These 2 examples, though, are not outliers. In fact, Sixtus's donation is less exceptional than it appears, I think. In many cases, civic authorities took the initiative to create for themselves collections that maintained memories of their past in a way that was publicly accessible. Sometimes local nobles played roles similar to the Grimani family in Venice, but usually towns seem to have acted to preserve material that was in some way already public, so found on public land, claimed by the institutions and put up. These public collections also complicate a simple progression of types of reuse, from spolia to collection to art object in museum, and blur the distinction between historical collection and modern museum. And I think that perhaps here the notion of preservation and then conservation is useful as a way of avoiding a kind of schematic effort to kind of talk about genres of collections. For the most part, the objects that these civic collections had were not for the pleasure and delectation of visitors. They offered public proof of a Roman past, and perhaps also some sort of instruction in that past. In that sense, I think they're closer to 16th century botanical gardens in Italy, or even, following on from last night, the idea of the museum as a lab for local history, than most of the grand private collections. And there's exceptions in Rome where there's a sense that if you went to one of these grand Roman collections, you were learning about the history of the city. I think that's true. The display at Bordeaux, for example, might look like an exception, but the combination of dedications to Drusus, Messalina, Claudius, and an unspecified Augustus, so these are kind of four members of the imperial family, made a clear assertion of Bordeaux's importance. When Herman van der Hem illustrated the collection in 1639, he showed what I think is a soldier looking at them. So this is here. Rather than the usual artist. So if you've ever seen kind of the Van Heemskerk drawings, you kind of see, here the kind of intrepid artist looking at the remains of Rome. It's a bit different in Bordeaux. The civic collection, I wonder, attracts a different audience from the artistic ensemble. The towns, as I said, were usually unable to hold on to prized pieces, but from local patriotism, they wanted to show objects of historical interest as a source of contemporary pride. In the history of collection of antiquities, we should be aware of focusing too closely on high-prestige ancient statuary or expensive gems at the expense of the more humble but culturally significant reliefs, altars, and inscriptions. And perhaps here it also is kind of worth thinking about the kind of the textuality of a lot of these things, that they're making statements. Even these statues with inscribed bases are kind of telling you something important. Finally, how effective and influential were these civic collections? Unfortunately, the towns did not necessarily preserve or conserve what they had in ways that were much more effective than private heirs were doing. Annio da Viterbo's 5 sarcophagi, for example, disappeared in Viterbo in the course of the 16th century. And that's if they existed, which is, some people have doubted. The inscriptions here, beneath the statues in Bordeaux, quickly deteriorated. They were virtually illegible at the end of the 17th century and are now lost. 18th century antiquaries in Pesaro and Palermo complained, perhaps self-interestedly, that their 16th century predecessors had not conserved their antiquities very well. And so, this is part of the justification for moving them to new museums away from kind of the civic palazzi to house them. But the actions taken in Osimo, Lector, or Brescia, for example, were effective and did protect and celebrate antiquities that might otherwise have been lost. The practice of using civic buildings to house antiquities did not take widespread root in the 17th century. It was only in the 1700s, I think, that new civic collections started to emerge, alongside the great new museums at the end of that period. Even then, the practice did not become common. I think that ecclesiastical buildings remained a more frequent solution. And I think this is, I haven't kind of really kind of tried to kind of nail this down, but I think there's an interesting question about why pagan inscriptions were still kind of reused in the 15th and 16th century in churches in this way. This is a later example when a local notary wanted to preserve Roman inscriptions in Vence, in Provence. He managed to have them built into the outside of the church walls, which were being restored. So this is where I went on my holidays, and I was very excited until I realized that it was much later than I realized. It seems reasonable, however, to argue that the local museums of history and culture that appear today in town halls or other civic buildings of small towns owe their origins to these developments. So, even though in many cases the number of objects in these assemblages is very small, it's legitimate to see them as important collections, I think, especially once we identify the deliberate roles that town authorities and humanists play in their creation. They've usually been viewed in isolation by archaeologists, historians, and art historians interested in single pieces or in the particular town where they're housed. And so their extent and their kind of contribution, as I said, to this sort of idea of a precursor of conservation has not been appreciated. Their fate is similar to that of many of the places where antiquities appeared in the medieval and Renaissance periods. On the one hand, archaeologists have been interested in extracting whatever information they can about particular objects from pre-modern records of antiquities, with little regard for how the records were made and how the antiquities displayed. On the other hand, art historians who focused on antiquities as models for new creations and agents in the history of tastes have overlooked the more mundane relics of the past. When scholars have looked at collections, they've tended to look at Rome for models, and as a result, our knowledge of the wider cultural roles antiquities might have played elsewhere is limited. These collections, however, show the importance of antiquities as a means of promoting a distinct local collection to the classical past, and a way for local town authorities to assert their role as custodians of that past. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the floor is now open for questions. Ty.
Thank you very much for this. Maybe two short questions from us. As a scholar of inscriptions, I'm wondering regarding the relation between antiquities, let's say materials, marble or so, objects, sarcophagi, and inscriptions. These are three things. Well, two of them, at least the material and the object, is mainly viewed, and the inscription we think is read. And I wonder to what extent actually these inscriptions are read, and to what extent they're actually serving as something to be viewed. To what extent these inscriptions are actually images, and only on a very small stratum of intellectual production they're actually dead for the content, and as civic monuments they're actually viewed. Which will lead me maybe to another question about script and historicity of script itself.
Right. Well, yeah. It's a very good question, and my evidence of the reception of these tends to be these manuscripts that these kind of learned elite would go around copying these things down, and they would focus very much on the wording and not on the object. In terms of the wider, but he was kind of brandishing it, then reading it, right?
It's just
Yeah.
to support the point that there can be both.
Right.
Be reading them as a sort of public performance to a lot of people, or interpreting them or using them as pointing to them to
Right.
a group that would see them
Right.
primarily as
Right.
text, but
Yeah.
understanding that they're text they couldn't read. And
Right. I mean, so the Osimo examples are kind of a good, right at the beginning, sorry. These ones are kind of interesting because in some cases the base and the statue are recorded independently, and in some cases, I haven't looked to see if the statues are recorded independently, but in some cases together. And so in that case, it looks as though, and the bases are kind of linked kind of textually. So I think that is a case, I think, where you're right, where you can think about different types of viewers. But I haven't found a good source of how people really looked at them. So yeah, it's the second bit.
Can I ask you first time? Recent scholarship dealing with spolia in medieval studies is carefully promoting the understanding that spoliation or the installation of spolia is sometimes used as a photovoltaic means for photovoltaic mechanism. And actually many of the spoliated artifacts you showed us today are installed on thresholds of buildings. Narbonne is a wonderful example, right?
Right.
Spolia for the sake of a center of the courtyard, or to the right, there's this bronze horse head that, according to the legends of Virgil, made all the other horses in Napoli be silent, right? This was a magical apotropaic mechanism. And Ulrich Fitzer recently argues that when Donatello is making a horse bronze head, he's actually copying the Virgilian bronze head from Carafa's courtyard in order to evoke the same apotropaic magical qualities of this bronze head. And so, and of course, you give the example of the Bit-Ville in Bordeaux, which is again overcoming the Gallic army, or the, as again as this apotropaic. And I was wondering to what extent are you willing to accept this in Renaissance studies? Also, maybe we should make a distinction between things that are public on the outside and a lot of these things that are inside palaces and are more private. There's a difference between exteriority and interiority also in the display of antiquities. So I'm just wondering.
Yeah, no. I mean, I am. And one thing, I think it kind of does blur, these categories. I've seen them less as kind of magical and more as like demonstrations of authority. That, these are the kind of the civic authorities saying, this is a. But I appreciate that the kind of blurring between authority and kind of magical power is kind of I'm unfortunately still a rationalist, but I think they could be both. Yeah.
Well, just given the idea of the spolia question that is so important, when does the Renaissance start? When is the transformation from something that's, this kind of medieval custom that's so ubiquitous to a self-conscious act that needs something different, or does it?
Right.
So that's one question, and then the idea that there are other there are examples. Giving one example, in Giuliano in the 15th century, the civic government reports that they are going to start restoring a medieval codex, and that so they're looking at this piece of it's a manuscript that they want to preserve called a Libro Bianco. It has kind of civic stuff in it.
Right.
In the 12th century.
Right.
And this is so. There's something that's very self-consciously historicizing, and I don't know whether that's the distinction that you want to draw, or whether it's something else. How can you deal with this issue?
Yeah, I think because I've kind of focused on Roman antiquities in a way that allows me to sidestep your question. That I wonder if the kind of
Or Villani talking about
Right.
the Temple of Mars, and there are all these examples of Renaissance people who are self-consciously creating genealogy through these examples, but for them there's a kind of continuity
Right.
between
Right.
the realm of the world and the
Right.
human world.
Well, even
That's-
to take another kind of manuscript example, the Codex of Law that the Pisa had and the Florentines went and stole in 1406. As far as I know, the Pisans really protected it as an artifact that was.
Yeah, kind of relic.
Right. And I don't know whether that counts as
So even though it's
conservation.
medieval rather than being
Yeah.
referenced.
I think, as you say, texts allow a kind of continuity that maybe kind of these objects, it's less easy to do.
Or is it just that we're so focused on this kind of medieval Renaissance that kind of
Right. Yeah.
subtlety?
Right. And what I didn't put in here because it makes it slightly more complicated is Frederick II putting up in Capua, where all these things were 300 years later. His arch displaying antiquities and niches, and as far as we can tell, I think it's kind of recognisably a triumphal arch of sorts. But it complicates labelsmithing.
Were any of these actually, these collections published by the Contextualizing? You found out 14 years publications.
Right.
Antiquities, which also have a very clear civic component in Augsburg.
Yeah.
Kind of the reinvention of the city in its Roman past. Is there any kind of textual?
Yeah. So the Osimo one, at the beginning of the 17th century, the guy who kind of reinstalled them in the new palazzo, he wrote a little 32-page thing about it.
And addressed to a wide audience? Or to
I assume not. No. It was. I think it was published by. I think it I think this is the one where it was published by his son, and his son said, "Oh, my father did this great thing, and it would be sad if it died with him," which suggested that he hadn't found an audience while he was still alive. But there's that the kind of the Bordeaux one, which I can't remember where it comes. No, the other way. There's the Bordeaux. There's a kind of a similar pamphlet, which this thing. But this actually talks about them before they are installed. So it's we found this, and I wonder whether he kind of produced this as a way of stopping anyone stealing them. They were documenting them, which would allow the town to take them over. So that's a kind of pre-cataloging, you know. I'm trying to think.
Doesn't sort of consciously celebrate them as part of the city's Roman past.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, no, it does. It does, and I think that's the argument. You know, implicitly, to keep them. That this is what we should do. Yeah.
What I could understand, the examples that you showed seemed to be things that more or less turned up accidentally. And so I wonder if there are any examples of any of these civic groups without having the portion of something turning up, intentionally decided to go out and try and find things to glorify the past or whatever.
I don't think so. I mean, again, there's the Annius. Yeah, that Annius buried them and then told the civic authorities to go and find them. You know, he suggested that they would find them in this place. Lo and behold, they did. But I can't think of another example.
So if it wasn't something that was set out with their intention, rather than that, it would seem that these are all examples that reflect a certain kind of attitude.
Right. And I wonder, and I suspect most of them were found, in this kind of rebuilding of city walls that took place in the 16th century. That they took, this was a kind of something that the city was taking on, or the town was taking on, and they found these things, and then they kept them.
I don't have a question, but you're very intriguing paper brought in yet another example to my mind, which brings us to Germany. We're in the beginning of the 16th century. A citizen of, I think it was Augsburg again, found a few ancient spolia in his garden, decided to display them, asking visitors to pay entrance fee. Until the city council decided that that wasn't appropriate and asked him
Where did they?
and took possession
Okay.
of the
All right.
spolia.
Yeah.
And I think this is a rather interesting example of what you said to
Yeah.
begin with the city council's self-imposed role in the preservation of their past. But also maybe more generally speaking of the role the spolia had in the discourse on history that I guess was meant to be publicly owned too. History was supposed to be collectively owned.
Right. No, yeah, that's very interesting. I didn't know that. And yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense. And and I think when Marcus Welser writes at the end of the 16th century, kind of that's the subtext of his part of when he kind of illustrates a lot of Augsburg antiquities, and I wonder if he's building on that. So, yeah.
I'm very intrigued by your pairing of the words conservation and preservation. So you
Right.
have a lot of precision
Right.
between them.
Right.
Do you find it the same?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder whether the notion of conservation really was. Yeah, I don't know. I think people who see the Latin word conservare, if people are being, when the Pope tells X to conserve something in this sort of way, I think people tend to translate it as preserve, just hold on to in some sort of way. So there is a vocabulary of restoration, but I don't know if there's something in between. Does that make sense? So yeah, I was kind of deliberately, I'm not sure, but my sense is that there isn't an established discourse that they're really using. Yeah, I'm afraid.
Just kind of, a lot of these questions have been circling around that issue, which is sort of the language issue. And I really appreciate your kind of Catholicism and urging us not just to look at one specific category, but all the categories. And I really like the fact that you get away from
Right.
Right. It's the word case, but there's also like the wrong case to use to make the rules. So this is great. And I just, on the issue of language, I guess I have questions about the Latin. And would love to hear more of your thoughts on how to really appropriately render the meaning of that. And like even as you were speaking before you said, I was thinking of the fact that the conservators and conservators. So I mean, it seems a word that needs real interrogation in specific cultural contexts. So I think we have one idea of potential resonance in Rome, which of course those people were also issuing edicts that use that same word. But do we have a sense of the word, how that word might have sounded in Brescia or some of the other places? And then my second thing is just about modern terminology, because what I really like the fact that you're not trying to, we have to get away from simple ideas about the modern museum began in 1471. But you did want to wanted to keep the language of the history of collecting, and you used the word collection often for these things, but then you also said assemblages, and I sense ambiguity in your mind, and I guess I want to push you on that too. Are all of these things collections? Is Narbonne a collection?
Right.
And maybe that has to do with Debbie's question of, you're going to argue that modern term is the relevant paradigm. Can you buttress it by saying, well, at the same time, the civic authorities were actively making collections of graphic evidence, they were actively seeking, and that goes beyond this turned up in our foundation, we're going to put it on the wall. Is that really collecting? So it's the modern terminology of collecting and the ancient, or the period terminology of conserving.
Right. I mean, the first question, I'm not sure, but it strikes me, and this kind of leapt out of me when Peter, as I said, when talked about the idea of, but I think what I should do to answer your question, which I haven't done, is to think about how these terms are used in Latin law, in the Codex Theodosianus, for example, because I suspect that, the kind of the bit here where they have denari vendi vel alienari, I assume that this comes from. Exactly. So I wonder whether, conservare similarly is used in legal texts.
What were the Roman conservators conserving?
Well, I think that's a good question. I don't know. Collection, yeah, no, I agree. You kind of, I'm kind of tiptoeing around. But I think it's legitimate to say, even in Narbonne, that they're finding these things, they're gathering them together, and putting them up in the same place.
Is gathering enough to be a collection?
Well, no, I think displaying them together, gathering and then displaying them together is enough. But yeah, I think I'm a bit nervous, partly because the history of collecting, as you said, 1471 it starts, and that's not, well, it's not quite true, but at least for Antiquities. Yeah, I mean, it's a, it's a good point.
I suppose, could it, when one uses the term civic authorities, I suspect very often those people are actually humanists who have an interest in the classical culture. And I think that's definitely true of us, but, and so I just wonder if it's sort of self-determining.
Right. And even more probably humanist lawyers, I suspect, or people trained in law.
I'm so sure that that's true. There may be places where very public thresholds, and that reminds me of, in many ways, even the previous centuries, when Richard Grabner talks about the use of spolia as to guarantee weights and measures. in
Right,
the
right,
public
right,
square.
right, right.
There were probably also things like this, as you mentioned, in interior rooms that haven't survived. And there, the audience was presumably the civic authorities that were getting different and maybe more specific messages from some of these things. I wonder if that makes
Right, but I assume
difference
also-
to
right.
government.
Right, no, but
Their
yeah,
responsibilities
yeah,
as
yeah.
conservators.
Yeah,
governments,
yeah,
because
yeah.
It would be a different message than the public or the forestieri might get outside. So.
Yeah, but I assume the people, members of the public who do go into these places, are people who have legal questions or need resolution, and as you say, seeing the interior stuff probably.
Many
Yeah.
audiences.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, there is a language for collecting, and that's, you know, the gems and cameos, and that's very private,
Right.
as we all know, and this is definitely very different.
Mhm.
So, if it's also collecting, then the term has to be kind of redefined.
Right. Right.
Because I think it is very different to have, to call something a collection in the city wall, as opposed to in your little study, in a drawer, private, that nobody else even has to show to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I think the case of Brescia is very particular, really. Do we have other case of civic decision at this time, so to preserve a really local?
Right. Not in such specific terms,
Mhm.
I think.
Because I really like the word conservare and publicis, because I think it's really important because they, after they tried maybe to find more inscriptions and antiquities in Brescia, because Brescia was very rich, and then they made special excavations. But at this time, it was really to preserve this document of the city, and I think that's the difference between collecting and conservare, and also the idea to make them public. And I think that's a very interesting document. I think it's really the first
Mhm,
document
mhm.
of conservation and for the community. So I think Brescia is really something
Right.
special.
And the Reggio Emilia proposal, so that's kind of a few years, really, 5 years after this, is not as specific. It's a bit more general. I was kind of hoping that they also would use conservare, but they don't. It's much more, promotion of our city and less legalistic. But I think you're probably right.
Well, would one, just following on Jeanette's question, would one possible approach here, since the use of conservare, and all the examples you gave, in fact, are essentially public, to comb through private communication, letters, even commercial documents, to see if amongst people who are operating for themselves, they use this language also, or whether there is something that connects this term to public function.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe this is a way of thinking about these private collectors, particularly if what they're collecting reflects their family. Maybe if it's a self-promotion, then maybe.
Yeah, and I think that's important because I think some of the private examples you showed, like Brescian, this is someone with public ambitions.
Right.
So in fact, it's a little bit violating some of the norms about. It's rather ballsy for a private family to
Yep,
do this.
yep,
It's
yep.
private claim, it's usurping in some way, and then authority above it. That other spots may have.
Right. He's arrogating
Yeah.
the kind of responsibility of doing this. Yeah. And even Manlio is kind of, there's an element of that. Yeah.
I'm very impressed by the documentary, by
Right.
understand conceptual framework of your presentation, but I just wonder of its relation to kind of terms that are today like preservation, conservation, or restoration, generally speaking.
Right. I mean, I think what you do get in the 16th century is restoration. I think there's the notion of if you have a fragment and build onto it, there's a language of there's I think by the end of the 16th century, there's a restorer. This is a term you could give to a particular sculptor. So I think there is, but whether that overlaps with this, I doubt very much at this point.
Right, because restore is very creative and creation with subject reference.
Yeah.
Which makes me very distant to our approach at Civic.
Right. Except that in Venice, the kind of restoration of statues in Venice, I don't know if you believe this, but I can't remember the name of the author, but the person who wrote about this sort of saying that the restorers were using ancient coins as a means of trying to work out, what an arm should look like that had been broken off, or this sort of thing. So I think there's a kind of a degree of historical sensitivity in that, but yeah. In general.
But restauratio is an even more overdetermined public term.
Right.
So then both of these terms have heavy public connotations.
Yes. Yeah.
I just want to short remark about the objects which you show, which was this beautiful example of different curriculum restoration, conservation, and come together. You show one of the objects with really, restoration as we know them today, with all those little fragments, were incorporated into the object and really recognizable. So I'm not one of the
That one. No. Those are the kind.
I think this one as well. But there was one in particular with all these inclusions where actually the word could talk about languages of restoration.
Right. Yeah. I'm not sure. I'm not sure which one.
Other questions? Well, you can ask them in the informal, jovial period that will follow outside with refreshment. But before we do that, a warm thanks to Will for stimulating